The F-16 sat dead on the tarmac. Around it, chaos erupted. Young engineers scrambled with laptops, their faces twisted with panic. Officers barked desperate orders into radios. The International Air Show started in 2 hours. Thousands watched from grandstands. But the Starjet wouldn't start. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Nothing. Still nothing, shouted Lieutenant Collins, slamming his fist against the side of the aircraft. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The engine won't even turn over. It's like she's completely dead. Captain Rodriguez jogged up to the group, his radio crackling with urgent messages. Command wants to know our status. The air show starts in 90 minutes, and this jet is supposed to lead the formation. Without it, he didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what this meant. Months of preparation, international reputation, and careers were on the line. The F-16 had been the squadron's most reliable aircraft for 15 years. She'd flown missions over 3 continents, survived 2 wars, and never once failed to start. Her nickname was Old Reliable, painted in small letters near the cockpit. But today, for reasons no one could understand, she was as lifeless as a museum piece. "Sir, we've run every diagnostic test twice," said Staff Sergeant Kim, looking up from her laptop. "All systems show green. The fuel is good, the electrical systems check out, the hydraulics are perfect. On paper, this plane should be ready to fly. But something's wrong and we can't figure out what." More engineers gathered around the aircraft, their voices mixing into a symphony of worry and confusion. They pulled panels, checked connections, and ran test after test. Nothing worked. The F-16 remained silent, stubborn, dead. In the growing crowd of uniformed personnel, no one noticed the old man standing at the edge of the group. He leaned against a maintenance cart, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His gray hair was thin and uncombed, his coveralls faded and stained with decades of grease and oil. A small name tag on his chest read Frank, but most people didn't bother to read it. Frank Delacroix was 73 years old, and to most of the younger crowd he was invisible. He'd been working on this base for 47 years, first as an Air Force mechanic, then as a civilian contractor after his retirement. He'd seen jets come and go, watched young faces age and disappear, and fixed more aircraft than he could remember. But these days, the young engineers with their computers and fancy equipment rarely asked for his help. He was just the old guy who cleaned tools and swept hangars. Frank remembered when this particular F-16 had first arrived at the base. She was fresh from the factory, her paint gleaming, her systems brand new. He'd been one of the first mechanics to work on her, checking every bolt, every connection, every wire. Over the years, he'd maintained her through countless flights, fixed her battle damage, and nursed her through more problems than the current crew could imagine. As he watched the chaos unfold, memories flooded back. He thought of another morning 35 years ago when a different F-16 had refused to start. The pilot that day was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a young woman who'd become one of the first female fighter pilots in the squadron. The mission was critical, a rescue operation in hostile territory. Like today, everyone had panicked when the jet wouldn't start. But Frank had found the problem. A single wire, no thicker than a pencil lead, had worked loose in a connection box that none of the diagnostic computers could reach. It was buried deep in the aircraft's belly, accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. He'd fixed it in 5 minutes, and Lieutenant Mitchell had completed her mission successfully, saving 3 downed pilots. Sarah had found him afterward and shaken his hand. "You saved lives today, Frank," she'd said. "Those computers can tell us what's wrong, but they can't tell us where to look. That takes experience." Frank never forgot those words. But Lieutenant Mitchell had been promoted and transferred years ago, and the current generation of engineers didn't seem to value that kind of experience. They trusted their machines more than the wisdom of an old mechanic. Now, as he watched the panic spreading around Old Reliable, Frank felt that familiar itch in his fingers. He knew this aircraft better than anyone alive. He'd touched every part of her, fixed every system, and listened to her heartbeat for 15 years. The young engineers were good at their jobs, but they were looking at the jet like a puzzle to be solved with data and logic. Frank saw her as a living thing with moods and quirks that couldn't be programmed into a computer. 30 minutes. Captain Rodriguez shouted, his voice cracking with stress. "We've got 30 minutes to get this bird in the air, or we scrub the whole formation." The engineers worked frantically, but their movements were becoming desperate rather than purposeful. They were starting to duplicate tests, second-guessing themselves, and making the kind of mistakes that come from panic. Frank set down his coffee cup and took a slow walk around the aircraft. No one paid attention to him, he was just the old cleaner making his rounds. But as he walked, his trained eyes took in details that others missed. The way the landing gear sat. The angle of the control surfaces. The barely visible scorch mark near the left engine intake that he'd noticed growing slightly larger over the past few weeks. He stopped walking and closed his eyes, letting his other senses take over. The smell of jet fuel was normal. The hydraulic fluid smelled right. But there was something else, something subtle that the others wouldn't notice. A faint electrical smell like the moment after lightning strikes. Frank's eyes snapped open. He knew that smell. He walked closer to the aircraft, studying the area around the left engine. The scorch mark was definitely bigger than it had been last week. And if he was right about what that meant? "Excuse me," Frank said quietly, approaching Staff Sergeant Kim. She barely looked up from her laptop. "Not now, Frank. We're in the middle of something important." "I know you are," Frank said patiently. "That's why I wanted to tell you about the left generator." "The generators are fine," Kim snapped. "We've tested them 3 times. Both generators show full output and normal operation." Frank nodded slowly. "The tests would show that. But have you looked at the connection housing for the left generator? Not the generator itself, but the housing where the cables connect." Lieutenant Collins overheard and turned around, his face red with frustration. "Look, old-timer, we appreciate the concern, but we've got sophisticated equipment here. We don't need to go poking around with our hands when we have computers that can tell us exactly what's wrong." "Computers are good," Frank agreed. "But sometimes they can't see what's right in front of them." "What are you talking about?" Captain Rodriguez had joined the conversation, drawn by the raised voices. Frank pointed to the scorch mark near the engine intake. "See that mark? It's been growing for about 3 weeks. Started small but it's getting bigger. That tells me there's been arcing in the electrical system somewhere nearby." "The electrical systems all check out," Kim insisted. "Every circuit, every connection." "On the surface, yes," Frank said. "But there's a connection housing about 18 inches behind that scorch mark. It's been there since this bird was built, and it's one of the few places the diagnostic computers can't directly test. If moisture got into that housing and caused corrosion, it could create an intermittent connection that would show as normal during testing but fail under load." The officers exchanged glances. They were running out of time and options, but trusting an old janitor seemed like desperation. "Look," Lieutenant Collins said, trying to sound reasonable, "we've got procedures to follow. We can't just start tearing into the aircraft based on a hunch from 20 minutes, someone shouted from across the tarmac. Captain Rodriguez looked at his watch, then at the crowd of frustrated engineers, then at the silent F-16. His career was on the line. The squadron's reputation hung in the balance. And despite all their technology and expertise, they were no closer to a solution than when they'd started. "What would you need to check?" he asked Frank. Frank smiled for the first time that morning. "Just a flashlight and a screwdriver." 5 minutes. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded. "Do it." The crowd of engineers stepped back as Frank approached the aircraft. Some looked annoyed at the interruption. Others watched with curiosity. A few smiled, remembering stories they'd heard about the old mechanic's legendary intuition. Frank moved with surprising agility for his age, crawling underneath the F-16's belly near the left engine. His movements were sure and economical, guided by decades of muscle memory. He disappeared from view behind the landing gear, leaving only his legs visible to the watching crowd. The tarmac fell silent except for the distant sound of spectators gathering in the grandstands and the occasional radio chatter from the control tower. Everyone strained to hear what Frank was doing, but all they could make out was the gentle scraping of metal on metal and the old man's steady breathing. "There she is," Frank's voice drifted out from under the aircraft, so quiet that only those closest could hear him. "Hello, beautiful. Let's see what's been bothering you." More scraping sounds, then a long pause. The engineers began to shift restlessly. Lieutenant Collins checked his watch and shook his head. "Got you," Frank said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. There was a sharp crack like breaking plastic, followed by the sound of Frank working with his screwdriver. The watching crowd held their breath. "Yep, just like I thought," Frank muttered. Corrosion ate right through the secondary connection. Been arcing for weeks, but the main connection was still good enough to pass the computer tests. Until this morning when the moisture finally completed the circuit failure. More scraping, then the sound of Frank moving around under the aircraft. A minute passed. Then another. 15 minutes, came the shout from across the tarmac. Captain Rodriguez was sweating now, and not from the heat. If this didn't work, he'd have to call off the air show. The embarrassment would be overwhelming, but worse than that, he'd have to explain to his superiors how he'd let an old janitor waste their last chance to fix the problem. Finally, Frank's legs began to move. He slid out from under the aircraft, his coveralls dirty and his gray hair disheveled. In his hand was a small plastic housing about the size of a matchbox, with blackened and corroded metal contacts visible inside. "This was your problem," he said, holding up the housing. The computer couldn't see it because the main circuit was still technically complete. But this secondary connection provides backup power to the starter system. Without it, the engine management computer gets confused and won't even try to start the engine. He walked over to a nearby parts bin and rummaged around for a moment, returning with an identical housing. "Lucky we keep spares of these. They tend to fail every few years, especially in humid climates." Frank disappeared under the aircraft again. This time, his work was quicker, the confident movements of someone who'd done this repair hundreds of times before. Within 3 minutes, he slid back out and stood up, brushing dust from his coveralls. "Try her now," he said simply. The engineers looked at each other uncertainly. After all their sophisticated testing and analysis, it seemed impossible that the solution could be so simple. But Captain Rodriguez was past caring about appearances. "Start her up," he ordered. Staff Sergeant Kim climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence. The familiar whine of the F-16 systems coming online filled the air. The crowd gathered closer, everyone holding their breath. Kim pressed the engine start button. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the F-16's engine began to turn over with a deep, healthy rumble. The sound built quickly, becoming the full-throated roar of a perfectly functioning jet engine. The aircraft seemed to come alive, trembling with barely contained power. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Engineers hooped and slapped each other on the back. Captain Rodriguez closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. But when they looked around for Frank, he was already walking away, heading back toward the maintenance hangar with his empty coffee cup in his hand. "Frank?" Captain Rodriguez called out. "Frank, wait." The old man turned around, a small smile on his weathered face. "Thank you," Rodriguez said, jogging over to shake his hand. "I don't know how to repay you. You saved the air show. You saved our reputation. You." Frank waved away the praise. "She's a good bird," he said, nodding toward Old Reliable. "She just needed someone to listen to what she was trying to say." Lieutenant Collins approached, looking embarrassed. "Frank, I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you from the start." "No harm done, son," Frank replied. "You did what you were trained to do. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it isn't. That's what experience is for, knowing the difference." Staff Sergeant Kim climbed down from the cockpit, her face glowing with relief and excitement. "The engine parameters are perfect. She's ready to fly." "Frank, how did you know? How did you know exactly where to look?" Frank was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I've been working on jets for almost 50 years, he said finally. "Each one is different like people. They have their own personalities, their own ways of telling you what's wrong. Computers can give you data, but they can't give you understanding. That only comes from time, from caring, from paying attention to the little things that others might miss." He looked up at the F-16, her engine now purring contentedly at idle. "I've known this particular bird since she was brand new. I've heard her when she's happy, when she's struggling, when she's in pain. Today she was in pain, but she was trying to tell us where it hurt. The computers couldn't hear her voice. But I could." The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the success and the story unfolding before them. Young airmen and seasoned officers alike listened intently as Frank spoke. 10 minutes to takeoff," came the announcement over the loudspeaker. Captain Rodriguez looked at his watch and then at Frank. "The pilot should be here any minute. Would you like to watch the air show? VIP seating? It's the least we can do." Frank shook his head gently. "Thank you, but I've got work to do. Besides, I've seen her fly 1,000 times. She's beautiful up there, but I like her best right here on the ground where I can take care of her." As if summoned by his words, Major Jennifer Hayes appeared, striding across the tarmac in her flight suit. She was the squadron's lead pilot, chosen to fly Old Reliable in the air show. As she approached the aircraft, she noticed the crowd and the unusual excitement. "Everything okay here?" she asked Captain Rodriguez. "More than okay," Rodriguez replied. "Frank here just saved the day. The bird's ready to fly." Major Hayes looked at Frank with newfound respect. She'd heard stories about the old mechanic, legends really, but had never worked with him directly. Frank Delacroix?" she asked. Frank nodded. "I've heard about you," she said, extending her hand. "They say you can fix anything that flies." "I just listen," Frank replied, shaking her hand. "And I remember." Major Hayes began her pre-flight inspection, running her hands over the aircraft's surfaces with the same care and attention that Frank had shown. As she worked, Frank watched approvingly. Here was another person who understood that flying machines were more than just collections of parts and systems. "She feels good," Major Hayes said, completing her inspection. "Really good. Like she's eager to get back in the air." "She is," Frank agreed. "She's been waiting all morning to show off." The pilot climbed into the cockpit and began her final checks. Frank stepped back with the others, but his eyes never left the aircraft. He watched every gauge reading, listened to every system as it came online, monitored every detail of the startup sequence. "Tower, this is Thunder 1, Major Hayes announced over the radio. "Ready for taxi. Thunder 1, you are cleared to taxi. And Thunder 1, good luck. Make us proud." The F-16 began to move, rolling slowly toward the runway. As she passed the crowd of mechanics and engineers, Major Hayes raised her hand in salute. The gesture was clearly meant for Frank, and the old man touched his fingers to his forehead in reply. Captain Rodriguez put his hand on Frank's shoulder. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you know things that our computers can't figure out?" Frank watched the F-16 reach the runway and align herself for takeoff. "Computers are good at math," he said. "They can calculate stresses and measure voltages and analyze data faster than any human ever could. But they can't love these machines the way we do. They can't feel proud when a jet flies perfectly or hurt when she's in trouble. They can't remember every time they've touched a particular aircraft or worry about her when she's in combat." The F-16's engine roared to full power, and Old Reliable began her takeoff roll. She accelerated down the runway with increasing speed, her landing gear retracting as she lifted gracefully into the morning sky. "Look at her go," Frank said softly, pride evident in his voice. The aircraft climbed steeply, her silver form gleaming against the blue sky. At exactly the right moment, Major Hayes rolled the F-16 into the first maneuver of the air show routine, a perfect barrel roll that drew gasps and applause from the grandstands. The crowd of mechanics began to disperse, returning to their regular duties now that the crisis had passed. But many of them paused to shake Frank's hand or pat him on the back. Word was already spreading across the base about what had happened, and Frank's legend was growing. Lieutenant Collins approached Frank one more time. "Frank, I want to apologize again. And I want you to know that from now on, if we have a problem we can't solve, you'll be the first person we call." Frank smiled. "I appreciate that, son. But remember, the computers aren't your enemy. They're tools and good ones. Use them for what they're good at, but don't let them replace your instincts. Trust the data, but trust your experience too. And most importantly, listen to the aircraft. They'll tell you what they need if you know how to hear them." As the air show continued overhead, Frank walked slowly back toward the maintenance hangar. His work for the day was done, but there would be other aircraft, other problems, other chances to help. He'd been doing this job for nearly 5 decades, and he had no intention of stopping now. Behind him, Old Reliable soared through her routine with flawless precision, her engine purring with contentment, her systems functioning perfectly. She was flying for the thousands of spectators in the grandstands, but in a way she was also flying for the old man who had listened to her pain and made her whole again. In the hangar, Frank poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and settled into his chair by the workbench. Through the open doors, he could hear the crowd cheering as the air show continued. But he wasn't watching the sky anymore. He was looking at the stack of maintenance reports on his desk, already thinking about the next aircraft that might need his help. Because that's what Frank Delacroix did. He listened. He remembered. And when the machines he loved were in trouble, he was there to make them whole again. The roar of jet engines filled the air as the formation flew overhead, but Frank was already lost in his work, ready for whatever challenge tomorrow might bring. Some heroes wear uniforms and medals. Others wear coveralls and carry screwdrivers. But they all share the same dedication to something greater than themselves. And sometimes, when hope seems lost and the experts are stumped, it takes an old veteran with gentle hands and a listening heart to remind everyone that experience and wisdom never go out of style.